My name is Ephraim Katzir, and on behalf of Sephardic Heritage International in DC, or SHIN DC, welcome to our Kabbalat Shabbat webinar series with instructor Hazzan Daniel Halfon, who will join us live from Jerusalem each week, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the US and Canada. We have an international group for this promising workshop, which is part of SHIN DC's Music of the Western Sephardi Tradition program, or the MOWST program, MOWST. SHIN DC's Kabbalat Shabbat webinar series with Hazzan Daniel is co-hosted by the United Congregation of Israelites, Sha'arei Shalom in Jamaica, which has a rich Western Sephardi history. Here is Hazzan Daniel Halfon.
Well, good evening to those of you in this part of the world, and good afternoon to those of you elsewhere. Let me welcome you as well to this series of lectures on the Friday night tefillah as conducted in the Spanish and Portuguese style. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ephraim Katzir and Sephardic Heritage International for organizing this event. And let me express the hope that you'll find it enjoyable and that you might possibly learn things that you didn't know before. I'd also like to thank Nachshon Rodriguez Pereira from Amsterdam, from the Bendigamos congregation, for preparing the PDF texts, which you all have access to. Okay, so as this is a lecture on music, let me begin with a Devar Torah. We have a pasuk which we actually say every Friday night, and we say it actually on Friday morning as well as the Shir Shel Yom. We say, Nachon kis'acha me'az me'olam ata. Comes from Psalm 93, and it means, your throne was established then, and it is eternal. Now, it's very nice, it's very poetic, but there is an inherent contradiction in that statement. We're saying, Nachon kis'acha me'az, your throne was established then, at a particular point in time. But me'olam ata, but it's eternal. Well, something which is eternal is, as we say in Adon Olam, beli reshit, beli tachlit. It's something which doesn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end. So how can you talk about a then and eternality in the same sentence? Well, let me offer you an answer. The Almighty is eternal. When we say me'olam ata, we're referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, and he is eternal. But his throne, his kiseh, dates from a specific time, a specific point in history. And that particular point in history was the moment when his people, Am Yisrael, acknowledged his kingship. And when did that happen? That happened immediately following the crossing of the Red Sea, immediately following Kriyat Yam Suf, where the pasuk in Shemot says, Vaya'aminu b'Hashem, and they believed in the Almighty, meaning they acknowledged his kingship. And how did they acknowledge his kingship and his sovereignty? By singing Az Yashir Moshe. The pasuk, the order of the pasukim is Vaya'aminu b'Hashem u'Moshe avdo Az Yashir Moshe. So, this is a very important thing from the point of view of the subject matter under discussion this evening and for the next 3 weeks. We acknowledge the divinity and the sovereignty of the Almighty through song. So song is no trivial element within Judaism. Song is inherently something which is structurally part of the way that we relate to the Almighty. Anyhow, that was the Devar Torah. And just to let you know what you're in from, you're going to be in from here, well, there'll be some recordings for you to listen to. But I would also like to investigate something of the historical and maybe even theological context of the tefillot and the songs that we're going to encounter. Next up is an apology. This series I entitled, perhaps rashly, Kabbalat Shabbat. But in fact, they will cover the entire Friday night tefillah, of which Kabbalat Shabbat is just one aspect. And that's the aspect we're going to cover this evening. So let's define our terms. Kabbalat Shabbat, I want to understand as the compilation of Piyutim, Tehillim, and Talmudic passages that precede the Arvit on Leil Shabbat, that precede the evening service on the eve of Shabbat. And to a large extent, that evolved amongst the Kabbalists of Tzfat during the course of the 16th century. So our starting point should be, let's take a look at what the Friday night tefillah might have looked like up until the end of the Middle Ages. Now, if we take a survey of some of the most important published orders of service that were produced from the 10th to the 14th centuries, and these would include the Sidur of Saadia Gaon, which was produced in Babylon in the 10th century, the Machzor Vitri, which was compiled by a gentleman named Simcha ben Shmuel, who was a student of Rashi in France in the 12th century, and had a decisive influence on the Ashkenazi tradition. And another very important work is Sefer Abu Dharam, which was written by David Abu Dharam in the 14th century in Seville. Now, if we look at any one of those orders of service for Friday night, we will find nothing resembling the Kabbalat Shabbat, or almost nothing of the Kabbalat Shabbat that we know today. So in those days, they would have had very little opportunity for any Carlebach melodies, which may be good news for some of you. But anyhow, proceeding even further to the Shulchan Aruch, which was published in Venice in 1565, there similarly, there is no mention of the Kabbalat Shabbat service. And most of the rubrics that you would find in the various Sidurim or Sidrei Tefillot would say something along the lines that Arbit should be read as it would be during the week, perhaps start a little earlier than usual. It was a very stark and in some ways empty framework compared to what we're used to today. Now, could you show slide number 1? I'll read it through the relevant passages in Hebrew and translate as we go along. And this is from David Abu Dharam, 14th century Seville. Arvit, nohagin bechol mekomot bisfarad, lomar vehu rachum kishar hayamim. So the custom was, in all places in Sepharad, to say vehu rachum, as we would say on any evening service. Now, this is a very strange thing because in our own tradition today, I don't think there's anybody who actually says vehu rachum. Vehu rachum is associated with the weekday service. And it's said neither on Shabbatot today nor on festivals. Yet in those days, it was said. He continues, Ukvar katavnu lemala b'shen ibn hayarchi shnei te'amim al shenahagu leomro. So there were two reasons, apparently, that were given by this Rabbi Ibn Hayarchi as to why Vehu Rachum was said. I won't go into those now because it's beyond the scope of our discussion. Just leave it to say that we no longer continue that practice. But I bring this to your attention to show how similar in character the evening service on a Friday night was to the evening services that you would have had during the rest of the week. Okay, continues. So the first change that would have occurred, we'll continue the next, which begins on the third line, second word in. Bekorin kriat shema bebirchotecha kishar yemot hachol belo girua ובלא תוספות. עד והושיענו בקרוב למען שמך. So the service would then continue from Vehurach u'mechaper avon without any subtractions or any additions from what was said during the week until you reach the very end of Hashkibenu, which is the second of the Barachot, which is said after Kriyat Shema, just before the Amidah. So you would go through the entire service on a Friday night, following exactly what would be done during the week. Now, we have no way of knowing exactly whether the tunes were changed, but certainly the text was identical. Okay. Now, moving along. So again, this is David Abudaram, and his take would have been what the practice of Seville was, and probably the minhag that was followed throughout all of Andalusia. Right. Now, in my description just now, I said that there was almost nothing which we might recognize from the Kabbalat Shabbat that we have today. But there may be one small little thing. And that small little thing is the passage from the Talmud, which we refer to as Bameh Madlikin, which is the second chapter of Masechet Shabbat. And that was included in the Friday night service. Now, a point of that's important to note. Originally, the custom was that Bameh Madlikin was said at the end of the tefillah. In other words, after the Amidah, after the Kaddish following the Amidah, then Bameh Madlikin would be read. And this was instituted by the Geonim for a very interesting reason. It was instituted as a device to allow latecomers to the synagogue to catch up with their prayers so that the entire congregation would be able to leave the synagogue together at the conclusion of the tefillah, ensuring that latecomers would not be put at risk by having to walk home on their own. So it was a security measure, in other words. Now, if we could go to slide number 2, please, Ephraim. The next one, yeah. That's it, lovely. So here we have a comment, which is in itself very instructive from David Abud Haram. And it begins as follows. ולאחר הקידוש נהגו לומר משנת פרק במה מדליקין. After the Kiddush, the custom was to say the Mishnah of Perek Bameh Madlikin. Now, the Kiddush in question here is something which in the Sephardi world has sort of fallen out of practice, but in the Ashkenazi world, some of you may have seen that it continues. The practice was that after the Amidah, after, in fact, the Magen Avot formula, the Kiddush was recited in the synagogue. And the reason for this was that synagogues functioned in part as sort of hotels in medieval communities, and people visiting different communities would have a place to stay within the synagogue and be fed, but they would need a place to hear Kiddush. And so what ended up happening was that the Kiddush was actually said in the synagogue. Now, this practice, as I've said, in the Sephardi world has died out, and I don't know of any Sephardi synagogues where it continues. Maybe some of you have had experience seeing it done in that way. But anyway, after this Kiddush was said, Perek Bameh Madlikin, Mipnei sheyesh ba dinei hadlaka, because it contains the rules regarding the lighting of the candles. ושלושה דברים שצריך אדם לומר בתוך ביתו, ערב שבת עם חשיכה, and so on and so forth. So it contains the rules of lighting candles and also the rules of what a man has to say to his wife to ensure that all the preparations for Shabbat have been made. But if we go down now to the fourth line, the last word on the fourth line, Abu Dharam says something very interesting. Veshamati, but I've heard, sheyesh mekomot, she'omrim perek zeh ben hamincha le'arvit. I've heard that there are places, in fact, where they don't say it at the end of the service, as I am used to hearing myself in Seville, but they say it at the end of Arvit. And he adds two words, ve'yashar be'enai. And this seems to me to be the correct thing to do. Why? Ki kriato achare Arvit ma to'il. Because to say it after you finish reading Arvit, what use is that? As, at that point, eno et letaken petilotav venerotav. There's no opportunity to correct, to fix the wicks or the candles, v'yaseh melacha, and to do any type of work whatsoever. Mashe haya haya, whatever has been done. Aval shekore oto ben mincha le'arvit, but if you read it between mincha and arvit, im shachach militaken yelech v'itaken. If he forgot to fix whatever needed fixing, he can quickly go and fix it. So you can already see that there's a little revolution in the offering, that this particular formula, this perek of Mishnah, which hitherto had been said at the end of the service, is now being moved to being said before the service. Dropping now to the next, sorry, we're still on number 2, Ephraim. We can go back to number 2. Sorry, yeah. That's it, yeah. Now, in the panel below, you have what the Shulchan Aruch writes about this particular issue, and this is 200 years later, remember. So, says Maran Yosef Karo, Noagin lomar perek bameh madlikim, והספרדים אומרים אותו קודם תפילת ערבית, והוא הנכון. So, it is already, by the time of Yosef Karo, writing in the 16th century, the practice had already been established in Sfarad that Bameh Madlikin was to be said before Arvit. So now we have an interesting development. We actually do have something which acts as a prelude to the Arvit. So this sort of sets the ground, so to speak, for people to think, well, maybe we should perhaps put other things in there. If we're going to be reading a Talmudic passage, that means that there does exist a temporal opportunity in which to introduce material. So, let's see what happens. Now, I should add as an aside here that everything that I've said applies to the places in which the particular Rabbanim that I've quoted lived and observed. And there was a degree of variation. Practices did vary between communities, and we do find instances here and there of things which could be seen as a precursor of the Kabbalat Shabbat. And one of those is Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat. Now, you may have noticed that up until now, Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat hasn't had a look in. Abu Ram doesn't mention it, Vitri doesn't mention it, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention it, but there was a certain Rabbi Shlomo Bar Natan of Morocco who lived in the 12th century whose practice was to do it. And apparently word got out that this was being done, and slowly but surely the practice of saying this particular perek, which is perek 92, started to be said in an increasingly large number of places through Sepharad. So, arriving finally at where we are, the development of the Kabbalat Shabbat service as we know it today was chiefly an evolution which took place in Safat, in northern Israel. And again, we should always bear in mind when considering this that it was an evolution which took place organically, it was spontaneous, and there were differences of opinion as to the form it should take and how it should be done. For example, one of the earliest innovations to come out of Tzfat was at the initiative of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who was, amongst other things, the brother-in-law of Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, who was the composer of the text of Lecha Dodi. Now, his practice was to precede Arvit with Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, borrowing the idea from the rabbi I just mentioned, the Rashban. He would add to that Psalm 93, the following one, Hashem Malach Gut Labesh, and he would precede both of them with the 29th Psalm, Habul Hashem Ben Elim. And all of these Tehillim had in common that they referenced Shabbat, either openly or by means of an allusion. Now, in the case of Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat, it's fairly obvious what the allusion to Shabbat is. Mizmor Shir Le'Yom HaShabbat. Not much of an imagination is needed there. Perek Tzadi Gimel, Hashem Malach Gut Labesh, needs a little bit more explanation. This is actually the psalm which, in most people's minds, is associated with Yom Shishi, Friday, as the psalm that was sung in the Bet HaMikdash by the Levi'im. And at one level, the poetry of the psalm describes, in an allegorical sense, the end of the creative process that was undertaken in the 6 days of creation, and ended on the sixth day with the creation of man. And again, we have an application of this particular phrase that I alluded to right at the outset. Nachon kisa'acha me'az. Because man was present in the world, so therefore the kingdom of the Almighty was established. And the universe at that point became fit for what we know to have been its original purpose, which was an olam shekulo Shabbat, a world which was eternally Shabbat. This, of course, went badly wrong with the chet, with the sin of Adam HaRishon, when he did what he did, together with Chava and the tree and everything else. But the original plan in the mind of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was to create a world just for Shabbat. So moving on to Psalm 29, the significance of that is the following. If you could show the next slide, please, Ephraim, which is number 4, I believe, isn't it? Yeah, number 4. No, one back, number 4. Could you go back a slide? That's it, lovely. Okay, so in this, many of you will be familiar with the text of this psalm. We sing it not only on Friday nights, but also, lost it. We sing it on Shabbat morning when we return the Sefer Torah to the Echal. And in it, could you go, because I just wanted to point this out visually. Just to the next slide, please. Yeah, you can see there, just a little bit higher so we get the whole thing. Yeah, you can see I've highlighted the words Kol Adonai every time they occur in the psalm. If you'd like to count with me how many there are, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The words Kol Hashem occur 7 times, and that is an allusion to the 7 days of the week, or the 7th day of the week, more correctly, which is Shabbat. So you have Kol Hashem al hamayim, on the waters, the voice of God is on the waters. Kol Hashem b'koach, the voice of the Almighty is powerful. Kol Hashem behadar, the voice of the Almighty is majestic. Kol Hashem shover arazim, the voice of the Almighty breaks the cedars. Kol Hashem chotzev lahabot esh, the voice of the Almighty divides the flames. Kol Hashem yachil midbar, the voice of the Almighty shakes the wilderness. Kol Hashem yecholel ayalot, the voice of the Hashem gives rise to the birth of calves from hinds. Anyhow, so that's why that psalm is included as an introduction to Shabbat, and in fact constitutes the final of 7 psalms which are said. So let me just back up here for a little bit. In terms of the practice of Kabbalat Shabbat in Tzfat, many of you may have heard this. There were a group of a group of students of the Ari HaKadosh, Yitzhak Luria, who would actually go out of the synagogue and into the fields. And out in the fields, they would say this 29th Psalm, Habu Hashem b'nei Elim, and they would follow it with the words, Boi kala, boi kala, boi kala, Shabbat malketa. Welcome, O bride, welcome, O bride, welcome, O bride, the Queen of Shabbat. And this actually follows a practice of Rabbi Hanina, who we read about in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Kuf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, for those of you who want to check, who would go into the fields at the time of, some 1,000 years earlier, and he would say, Bo netze likrat Shabbat HaMalka, let us go out and greet the Shabbat Queen. Interestingly, Moshe Cordovero, who I mentioned earlier, the brother-in-law of Al-Kabetz, was against the practice of leaving the synagogue, and he interpreted the idea of meeting the Shabbat not by going out to meet the Shabbat, but starting the tefillah before nightfall so that you would be in a position to meet the Shabbat as it came in. So again, you can see there was a difference of opinion as to how to practice what were then those new items that were being introduced into the order of prayer. At all events, by the later part of the 16th century, the Kabbalat Shabbat service became established in more or less the form that we know it today. Very, very briefly, before reading Habul Hashem b'nei Elim, a further 6 psalms were added, representing the 6 days of creation. And the crown jewel, the centerpiece of the whole Kabbalat Shabbat service was the Piyut Lecha Dodi, written by Shlomo Al-Kabetz himself. If you could show us, Ephraim, please, slide number 4. Now, this is a very interesting slide because what it shows is the form of Kabbalat Shabbat, which became adopted by different communities. We have the Moroccan, Yerushalmi, Ashkenazi, and Italian. I don't want to go in great detail into them. You can do that, perhaps, if you're interested, on your own. But one thing I do want to point out here is that the Spanish and Portuguese scores the highest marks for brevity. As you can see, it doesn't have any of the psalms leading up to Habul Hashem b'nei Elim, as all of the other Edot do. You have Mizmor David, Bameh Madlikin, Lecha Dodi, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Kadish Rabbanan, and that's it. So what the Spanish and Portuguese did, probably intentionally, was to adopt a format which would bear the closest relationship to what had been done in Spain before the expulsion. I should say that the Spanish and Portuguese as a community, as a mindset, is incredibly conservative. Change is often an anathema to them. So I think because of the popularity of the Piyut Lecha Dodi, I think they felt that, well, they didn't have a choice but to adopt that because it was so overwhelmingly popular. But as to all the other stuff, they just took the bare minimum. Habul Hashem b'nei Elim already was traceable to an earlier period. Bameh Madlikin, similarly traceable to an earlier period. As we'll see later, Amar Rabbi Elazar needs to be there for a technical reason in order that a Kaddish can be said. But suffice it to say that the Spanish and Portuguese really took the minimum that was possible and still were able to call it Kabbalat Shabbat. Now, at this point, I think I had a lot of things that I wanted to say about the music, but perhaps I can say that I can keep that for future weeks. And I should really now start with the tefillah, with the music itself. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. So if you could if you wouldn't mind going on to slide 6. Okay, here we go. Now, the custom in the London Spanish and Portuguese community is when the service begins, the Hazzan announces in Portuguese, well, partly in Portuguese and partly in Hebrew, who the holders of the mitzvot to be performed the following day will be. And he says a mishiberach for them. And I'll give you an example of how that would work. Mishiberach abotenu yevarech et הגביר אברהם דמשה לופס דיאס כדירה הזמירות ואת הבחור דוד יצחק גומז דמסקיטה כדירה אוהשי מלך ואת הגביר אליעזר דשמואל נונס וז כדירה ההפטרה ברוכים הם למוני. So what's happened there is three particular individuals have been singled out. One will read the Zemirot or the Pesukei de Zimrat the following morning. There will be a young man, a child actually, who would read the Pasuk Hashem Melech, and then another gentleman who would read the Haftarah. And these people are already given a Mishiberach on the evening before the morning on which they will perform those mitzvot. Okay, so now we can start the tefillah. So, what I would ask now, Ephraim, if you wouldn't mind, go to track 1. Those of you who have the text printed out, it is the very first thing which appears on the text, Mizmor LeDavid Habul Hashem B'nei Elim, and this is in the style of London.
מזמור לדוד, הבול אדוני בני אלים, הבול אדוני כבוד ועוז, הבול אדוני כבוד שמו, ישתחוו לאדוני בהדרת קודש, כל אדוני על הבאים. אל הכבוד הרים, אדוני על מים רבים, כל אדוני בכוח, כל אדוני בהדר, כל אדוני שובר ארזים, וישבר אדוני את ארצי הלבנון, וירקידם כמו עגל, לבנון בציון כמו בן ראמים, כל אדוני עוצב להבות אש, כל אדוני יכיל מדבר, יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש, כל אדוני יחולל איילות, וינסוב יערות ובכלו, כולו אומר כבוד, אדוני למבול ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום.
That particular mode of psalmody has its origins in North Africa. And it's somewhat different from the Yerushalmi version, which some of you may be familiar with. And the difference between the two is it's quite interesting. The Spanish and Portuguese uses what is described as the Yerushalmi version for its festive psalms. So, for example, instead of what you just heard, you would hear something like Mizmor LeDavid, Habul Adonai b'nei Elim, Habul Adonai kavod va'oz, Habul Adonai kebod shemo, Ishtachavu l'Adonai be'adrat kodesh, Kol Adonai al hamayim, El hakabod irim, and so on and so forth. The New York community of Spanish and Portuguese uses that mode rather than the one we just heard for the way they sing Habul Hashem B'nai Elim. And it's interesting. I think there's the basis of a PhD thesis there as to why they went this way and the London and Amsterdam community went the other way. I have to say that although these modes are very similar, they are actually not harmonically compatible. And I know this from experience because I've been present in synagogues with different participants in the congregation sing both melodies at the same time. Doesn't work. But they refuse to be open to the argument that it doesn't. Alrighty. I did have some other versions of this to play, but I think we've overrun our time. So let me move on now to something else, which is Bameh Madlikin. Now, Bameh Madlikin, as I mentioned earlier, is the second perek of Masechet Shabbat, and deals with the fuels and so on and so forth that can be used for the kindling of Shabbat candles, and talks about the various preparations and checks that need to be made before the onset of Shabbat. Now, this is a tricky text to read, being Mishnaic Hebrew and being a recitative. It doesn't. The melody doesn't, so to speak, carry you along. So it was used as part of the test or the aprova in the Portuguese community in Amsterdam to test the candidate for his suitability and aptitude for the position of Hazzan, which was measured, apart from whether or not he could sing in tune, by his ability to read a demanding Mishnaic Hebrew text with his teeth remaining intact. And I have to say, personally, when I became Hazzan in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York about 42 years ago, a certain member of the board of trustees made a point of coming to my first Friday night service. He was an observant man, and he didn't live near the synagogue, so he took a hotel room nearby, the Hotel Olcott on 72nd Street, if any of you know that. All this to ensure that my reading of Bameh Madlikin adhered to the standards of reading demanded. And apparently he was satisfied because he didn't complain. So the next track that you're going to hear is Bameh Madlikin. Let me just make sure that we've got the right one here. Just a second. Yeah, that'll be Ephraim. That'll be number 4, track number 4. And before we start, I'd just like to say that in these recordings, I tried to replicate the tradition in the London community of the choir spontaneously harmonizing with the Hazzan. It was the sound that I grew up with, and I find that the blending of the voices adds a special musical and spiritual quality to the whole experience. So if you wouldn't mind playing that, Ephraim, track number 4.
Bameh Madlikin, ובמה אין מדליקין. אין מדליקין לא בלחש ולא בחוסן ולא בחלך, ולא בפתילת העידן ולא בפתילת המדבר, ולא ברוקה שעל פני המים. לא בזפת ולא בשעבה ולא בשמן קיק, ולא בשמן שרפה, ולא בעליה ולא בחלב. נחום המדי אומר, מדליקין בחלב מבושל, והחכמים אומרים אחד מבושל, ואחד שאינו מבושל, אין מדליקין בו. אין מדליקין בשמן שרפה ביום טוב, רבי ישמעאל אומר, אין מדליקין ביתרן, מפני כבוד השבת. והחכמים מתירים בכל השמנים, בשמן שומשימין, בשמן אגוזים, בשמן צנונות, בשמן דגים, בשמן פגומות בניטרן ובנפט. רבי טרפון אומר, אין מדליקין אלא בשמן זית בלבד. כל היוצא מן העץ אין מדליקין בו אלא פשתן, וכל היוצא מן העץ אינו מטמא טומאת אוהלים, אלא פשתן. בתילת הבגד שקיפלה ולא יבבא, רבי אליעזר אומר, תמאים אין מדליקין בה. רבי עקיבא אומר, טהורה היא ומדליקין בה. לא ייקוב אדם שופרת של ביצה, ממלאנה שמן, ויתננה על פי הנר, בשביל שתהא מנטפת, ואפילו היא של חרס, מרבי יהודה מתיר. אבל אם חיברה היוצר מתחילה מותר, מפני שהוא כלי אחד. לא ימלא אדם כער השמן, ויתננה בצד הנר, ויתן ראש הפתילה בתוכה, בשביל שתהא שואבת, מרבי יהודה מתיר. המכבה את הנר, מפני שהוא מתיירא, מפני גויים, מפני ליסטים, מפני רוח רעה, מפני החולה שישן פטור. ככס על הנר, ככס על השמן, ככס על הפתילה, חייב. רבי יוסף פוטר בכולן חוץ מן הפתילה, מפני שהוא עושה פחם. על 3 עבירות נשים מתות בשעת לידתן, על שאינן זהירות בנידה ובחלה ובהדלקת הנר. 3 דברים צריך אדם לומר בתוך ביתו, ערב שבת עם חשיכה, ניסרתם נרבתם, הדליקו את הנר. ספק חשיכה, ספק אינה חשיכה, אין מנסרין את הוודאי, ואין מטבילין את הכלים, ואין מדליקין את הנרות. אבל מנסרין את הדמאי, ומערבין וטומנין את החמין.
We'll move on now to Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi is, if you could flip up to the Lecha Dodi page on the, yeah, you can see Nachshon has done it very clearly. If you look at the right-hand margin, you can see Shlomo, Shim Lamed Mem Hey, followed by Hey Lamed Vav Yud. So you have Shlomo Halevi, which is an acrostic of his name. And to say something just very briefly about the piyut, there are 9 strophes, and only 3 of them actually specifically mention Shabbat. On the whole, the piyut is a piyut which looks forward to the Messianic age, of which, again, this idea of the Olam Shekulo Shabbat, which is the Messianic age, so the link between Shabbat and the reign of the Mashiach are very, very closely linked. Many of the phrases that you will find in Lecha Dodi actually lifted or borrowed from Yeshayahu, specifically the Haftarot, which we read at this time of the year, the Shiva de Nechemta, which are the Haftarot that we read between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. Yesterday, for example, we had the phrase V'rachaku mevale'aich, which is a well-known phrase from Lecha Dodi. The week before, V'nigla kevod Hashem, also a well-known phrase from the piyut. Now, let me say something very briefly about the melody. In his volume, The Ancient Melodies of the Liturgy of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the Hazzan of the 19th century, the famous Hazzan David Aaron de Sola, writes that the melody for Lecha Dodi in use in the Spanish and Portuguese communities considerably predates the composition of the piyut itself. And he cites rubrics in old prayer books which direct it to be sung to the tune of a piyut by Yehuda Halevi called Shuvi Nafshi Limnuchaichi, which had been written some 500 years earlier than the text of the Lecha Dodi. So, leaving aside the irresistible temptation to speculate that this was actually the melody sung by Alkabetz himself, one can certainly say that it is one of the oldest melodies extant for Lecha Dodi. Now, as far as the Spanish and Portuguese is concerned, some points to note. Number one, the refrain, Lecha Dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat nekabela, is not repeated. One might even say we refrain from repeating it. Also, the congregation sits during the singing of Lecha Dodi, standing only for the final strophe, Boi b'shalom, and under no circumstances faces the Hechal, faces away from the Hechal, excuse me. If you look at a Sephardi, Spanish and Portuguese style synagogue in its normal configuration, where the seats face opposite each other, they simply get up from their seats and face across the synagogue as they would for anything else. There is no turning towards the door. Now, the first example I would like to play of Lecha Dodi, and I think we've got time for a couple. The first one is from the Isaac Levy anthology, and this is their most incredible work. There was an Israeli musicologist by the name of Isaac Levy, also a singer in his own right, who put together an anthology called Antologia de Liturgia Judeo-Española, 10 volumes, investigating almost every Eda within the Sephardi world, including the Spanish and Portuguese. But what I'm about to play for you, he records as the melody from Casablanca. And the reason I want to play it for you is because it is perhaps a prototype for the one which eventually found its way into the community in London, which I'll play next. So let me just give you the track, Ephraim. It will be number 5.
Shabbat nekabela Shabor vezachor bedibur echad ishmianu el hameyuchad Adonai echad Oshmo echad L'shem ultiferet velithilah Likrat Shabbat Lekhuven elecha Ki mekor haberacha Merosh mikedem nesucha sof maseh b'machashava tehillah.
That was the Casablanca version of Lecha Dodi, which perhaps is the oldest of the family of melodies for Lecha Dodi, which is shared by the Spanish and Portuguese community. Before we do the London one, which will be the final thing that we do, I'd like to play you an extract from the New York tradition. The reason I want to do that is because there is a very marked similarity between the one we just heard and the New York version, although one has to bear in mind that it's 3,000 miles further west, and the New York version was harmonized. So if you could play, please, Ephraim, track number 7.
לך אדוני לקראת כלה לשבת נקבלה שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד
That was a recording made in 2006, and it's from the CD Kamti Lehalel, which I was involved in a small way. The final offering for this evening is the London version of Lecha Dodi. It's a very short extract, you'll be pleased to hear. And what I'd ask you to do is, as you listen to that, think about what you just heard and see how musically the relationships between all three Lecha Dodis that you will have heard interact. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, let me just check which one it is. Number 8, please.
Lecha Dodi likrat kala peni Shabbat nekabela shamor mezachor bedibur echad ishmi'anu el hameyuchad Adonai echad ushmo echad Hashem utiferet belitila oy beshalom atere bala gam besimcha berina utzahola toch emuneh am segula boi chala Shabbat menucha toch emuneh
Well, that concludes the sort of formal lecture part of the proceedings this evening. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. Not promising that I'll know the answers, but anything that you'd like to discuss, I'm here for you.
Hazzan, Daniel, could you reiterate again how the Bameh Madlikin was moved from the end of Mariv to the beginning historically?
Is that Richard?
Yes, Richard.
Hi. Okay, as I understand it, the Bameh Madlikin was instituted before the 10th century, and it was at the end of Arvit. As I say, as a device, along with actually Mein Sheva was another such a device to prolong the service to allow latecomers to catch up. But I think people felt that, reading the text, it was a very little practical application at that point in the day, because if there was to be some practicality attached to a text, particularly a halachic text, you ought to be able to do something about a situation if, on reading the particular halakha, you remember that you didn't do it correctly or you needed to fix it. So how exactly, in which place, it's not clear. But definitely there was a feeling in Sepharad that it should be moved to a period before the actual formal onset of Shabbat. Now, that said, I have to confess to you, my very first time going to an Ashkenazi tefillah for Erev Shabbat, I thought this was funny. They're not saying Bameh Madlikin. And then just before Alen Shabbat, it said at breakneck speed in an undertone, and I thought they just must have forgotten it. And somebody must have just reminded that, you didn't say Bameh Madlikin, you better say it now. But apparently that was their custom is actually the original one. I don't know if that helped. Did that answer your question?
Oh, it did. Yes, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Some of the melodies are quite similar to, and others are very different from those in the Sephardic community of Seattle, where I lived for a number of years.
Sorry, who's speaking? I just want
to... my name is Risa, and I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland.
Okay.
Here, let me turn on my video.
I'm just trying to find your video, yeah. From Silver Spring. Do you know Rabbi Breitowitz?
Yes, but from another era.
Okay, yeah, he's somebody that I've found you. Okay.
From another era. But I'm interested.
In now, by the way.
Yes. Some of the melodies that you presented today are quite similar, and others are very different from the ones that I heard in Seattle, which is primarily Turkish and Rhodes Lee.
Rhodes Lee, yeah.
And I'm wondering how it comes to be that there are all of these different points of convergence and divergence.
Okay, that's a very good question. You have to remember the Spanish and Portuguese tradition was a sort of reinvented tradition. The Anusim who came from Spain and Portugal, the conversos, the former new Christians.
Sepharad.
Yeah, well, they were Gerushe Sepharad, but these were people who had become Christian, remember? They were new Christians who felt that life had become, because the Inquisition, of course, operated not against Jews, but against new Christians. Mm-hmm. People who were suspected really of being Jewish, but who pretended to be Christians. Mm-hmm. And when they came to Northern Europe, meaning Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, and then somewhat later, but not much, to the eastern seaboard of the United States, they came knowing nothing. And the communities realized that they had to, in pretty short order, put together their traditions. So they brought in teachers from different parts of the Sephardi world. And there were teachers from Morocco. There were teachers from the Ottoman Empire, I'm thinking particularly of a Hazzan by the name of Gallego, who I think was sort of Greek-Turkish origin. And certainly a guy like him, with his provenance, would account for why there is a similarity between the Turkish style and the Rodisli style, and the Spanish and Portuguese, because the guy they brought in to teach them, that was his background. So yeah, that is indeed a very good question, and for that reason, you see in the Spanish and Portuguese a sort of, I would almost describe it as layered musical landscape, in the sense that certain bits, for example, Kriyat Torah and the Haftarah, I would say sacred text in general, the teachers of that material were from North Africa, which is why the Spanish and Portuguese Ta'amei Mikra, for the Haftarah, for Parashah, and for various other Megillot, are virtually identical with the Moroccan.
And very different from what I heard in Seattle.
Correct. Whereas, and I've often been struck by this, the style of the motifs for the Yamim Noraim that are used for, let's say, the Amidah, are very, very similar to Levantine styles.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a Halabi guy saying Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. It's very similar to the Spanish and Portuguese. So the guy who specialized, who gave the classes, so to speak, back in the 16th century on how to do high holidays, well, he was a guy from the Levant.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the course of the centuries, it all became melded into one complete tradition. But the origins of different parts of it are actually different, in my opinion.
So it was basically a reconstructive process.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And it made for some interesting permutations and combinations.
Absolutely so. That particular, the evolution of the musical tradition of the Portuguese is a very interesting thing. And on top of all of that, of course, is the Western influence, the Western influence of Baroque, Renaissance, and later music on the repertoire of the community. Two things happened. First of all, they had pieces commissioned by both Jewish and non-Jewish composers for special occasions, and the melodies which had come to them from North Africa and from the Middle East and from the Ottoman Empire underwent certain changes to conform to Western musical canons, so that you would find pieces resolving to the tonic as they do in Western music, whereas in their original forms they wouldn't have done. So it's incredible. It's in fact, one of the things that I think I can say without fear of any contradiction is that the Spanish and Portuguese as a musical tradition is probably the one most closely observed and commented upon by academic musicologists. For two reasons. One is because of this wonderful evolutionary path that it has, and secondly because there's so much material, printed material and written material available for scholars to see and study. Yeah.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, and I just want to remind everyone that between classes you can email questions to Hazzan Daniel. His email is Daniel Halfon @shindc.org. And if you have any administrative or other questions, please email info@shindc.org. And all of this information is on the email that we sent out, and also on the class page, which you can access with the password once you register. And so thank you so much again, Hazzan Daniel.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I have to be honest, it's the first time I've done a Zoom, so I'm still sort of getting the feel for it, but it wasn't as daunting as I thought it would be.
Well, that's good. I've done quite a number, and I'm still getting the feel of it. So,
well, yeah,
pretty well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hazaku Baruch, Hazzan Daniel,
Pleasure.
and
Well, it was very well prepared. Thank you very much.
Who's that? Sounds like Rick.
Rick Sofa in London.
I
wanted
thought
to
it was you.
be very well prepared. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't have anything to ask, but I want to thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It's been really interesting. And I've learnt a lot. So thank
Oh, well,
you.
that's good to hear. Thank you so much.